It looks very.
Okay, thank you to Sabrina Nanji from the QP Reporter for coming on once again to talk what seems to be the top story in Ontario political circles these days is the rumor that Premier Doug Ford might call an early election uh, because things are going rather swell for him according to the polls. Sabrina, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's just get into the thick of it. Are there any truth to these rumors? How serious are the Ontario PCs considering pulling an early election before the June 2026 scheduled election date?
Yeah, you're right. This all started as rumor, but in the past couple weeks and days, it's really ramped up and gained a lot of steam. Now, take all of this with a grain of salt because it is a lot of rumor, but I think there is some serious thought being given to the possibility of an early election here in Ontario. Of course, nothing is set in stone, but certainly from what my sources are saying, and as we've seen elsewhere, it's something Doug Ford is seriously considering. And there's a lot of, I guess, hints that have poured gasoline on these rumors and this speculation. And as you said, it would be politically advantageous for Doug Ford to go to the polls earlier than our fixed election date of June 4th, 2026. And we can also dig into that too. But yeah, I think that at this point, nothing is set in stone, but even the premier himself is not really ruling anything out. So it's still a touch and go. But you're right. This has really dominated the headlines. And the most cynical parts of me is wondering if that's maybe by design, because we're all talking about the possibility of an early election rather than, say, the privacy commissioner now digging into the greenbelt. Not so good news for Doug Ford, something he probably would rather not talk about. And I guess a lot of other maybe not so great headlines that have been going on. So lots to dig into, but a lot of speculation and rumor. And I mean, that's kind of the fun part of the job, right?
Well, I mean, if you look at the face of it right now, it kind of does make sense. I mean, despite, as you said, despite the Greenbelt scandal, Ontario Place coming up to the light, and numerous the Stag and Doe uh, uh, scandal and whatnot. You know, these things don't really seem to be sticking to Doug Ford. Like you think after 6 years of this, the electorate would be kind of saying, okay, enough's enough. We need a change in a change in the captaincy at Queen's Park, but that doesn't seem to be really sticking to Doug Ford. People still seem to like him, and he's riding high in the polls. I mean, he's pushing ahead with Highway 413 is a big, that kind of seems to be a big linchpin of his electoral platform now, is pushing forward with this. It doesn't, it, I mean, it does seem to make sense to me that he would seriously consider, well, why not pull the trigger now? I'm guaranteed to probably win another majority if the polls stay true. Um, like, doesn't it just make sense though for him to just say, yeah, let's do it?
Oh yeah, it totally does. And a lot of conservative insiders I've been talking with are actually, I think, encouraging the premier to go early because you're right. This is probably the most advantageous time for them, and they want to strike while the iron's hot. They're fresh off two by-election wins in Milton, which was a bit of a tougher race, and we had talked about that a few weeks back, and also Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, a stronghold of theirs. But still, they're feeling good after that. Generally, they're riding high in the polls. The Liberals and NDP are a little, closer neck and neck, but it's still nowhere close to where the Conservatives are. I just actually did a roundup of the year-end fundraising from 2023, and like the difference is huge. The PCs closed out the year with 8 million in the bank, over 8 million in the bank, and the other parties are, around 2 million. The Greens are not really even close to that, around 500,000. But that's all. Obviously, you need to have money to run a competitive campaign. The Conservatives are already spending millions on attack ads against Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals, but also pumping up the premier and even leaning into some of these gaffes that you mentioned, right? Like the Greenbelt saga, he sort of said, well, you don't always get it right in his latest ad spot. And that, that's a very human thing. We all make mistakes. But then again, this is the Premier of Ontario we're talking about. So we'll have to see if that flies with the public. But there's a lot here. And you mentioned that they've been making a lot of progress on some of these big, ambitious projects. The Highway 413, I mean, they say that construction is going to start early 2025. Obviously, these transit announcements tend to get delayed, as we know, but that's the running date right now. And I think the thing that's really, sparked these rumors about an early election is the fact that they've spent millions of dollars to speed up the beer store, or the breakup with the beer store, I should say, breaking up that monopoly. Initially, it was on track to happen by early 2026, and now we're spending millions, up to potentially $1 billion. Of course, there is some dispute on the math of it, but to break this early. And so I think that what it seems like is that Doug Ford is setting the stage to be able to go to voters, as I'm hearing, by early 2025, to say we have finished or made tangible progress on a lot of our key pledges here, and now we need a fresh mandate. So I really think that's the only way Doug Ford could justify it, because how do you go to the public and say, we're going to go have a snap election, and beyond it being self-serving for the Conservatives, you kind of have to justify this. It would be a strict scramble for Elections Ontario, and I think I just want to add the other factor in the possibility of an early election that the Conservatives are thinking about is the timing of the federal election, right? If Pierre Poilievre becomes Prime Minister, as all the polls are suggesting, I think that would be tricky for Doug Ford, from a political standpoint, because Ontario tends to vote opposites at Queen's Park and on the Hill. But also, a lot of folks on Pierre Poilievre's team and the campaign team would, kind of cross over with Doug Ford's team. So I think they might potentially lose out on some resources, volunteers, door knockers, that type of thing, if it was going to be so closely with the federal election. So there's so many factors at play here. But at the end of the day, what this has done, even just speculation, has sort of created this red herring of headlines, because we're all talking about this, but it's also sent the opposition parties scrambling. Like, I have heard that Liberals and New Democrats are now preparing for the possibility either way. And so they've really got to, especially Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals, who are the newest on the block, they've really got to now prepare for the possibility of an election. So I think no matter what, Doug Ford is probably sitting back and, twiddling his fingers gleefully that this is now the talk of the town at Queen's Park.
Yeah, which almost sort of encouraged me to want to change the subject, but I, but we can't. I mean, I guess there are risks with this. The traditional, certainly in recent years, there seemed to be a sort of rule in Canadian politics, federally and provincially, that the person who, particularly during minority governments, that the person who forces the election is the one that loses, because you almost get punished by the public for calling the election. So is there a risk that, and actually I think another place this happened recently was in the UK, where I can't remember, a couple of prime ministers back called an early election and was expected to win easily and didn't. Is there a risk that Doug shoots himself in the foot by doing this?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, it's also happened in Ontario back in the day when David Peterson tried to call a snap election, and he was essentially punished by voters. It was the same situation. I have heard some Conservative insiders say that the way that they would spin this or frame it to the public would be that, we've gotten a lot of our promises done. We need a fresh mandate from the public.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if voters would punish Doug Ford so much about that. And I think about, voter fatigue and the timing of this, that if, the date that's floating around out there is spring 2025, and it's a big if, there's going to be an early election. But if that were to happen and the federal election maybe happens in the fall, and then right after that, we've got municipal elections in Ontario, I kind of wonder about voter fatigue. And again, if provincially, the province goes first, then maybe turnout would be better, but also low turnout is also an advantage for Conservatives. I mean, just typically when turnout is lower, that tends to favor Conservatives. So again, that could still be a win. And I think maybe the turnout side of it, but especially when it comes to the opposition parties too.
And I guess that almost answers my next question, which is like, if they're going to go early, when? And doesn't that, a winter election in Ontario is a kind of dangerous thing. It's tough enough hitting those doorsteps when it's sunny, when they're covered in ice and snow. It's a real challenge. I mean, do you think it would literally be a winter election, sort of January, something like that?
I know. I think that would be diabolical because for all the reasons you just laid out. I'm not sure if we would see that. I mean, we heard the premier say for sure it's not happening this summer or this fall, which again, doesn't really do much to tamp down these rumors. But I think they would stick with spring and June. The big question is just what year, I guess, and also what is it going to look like? Because I've also heard that Ontario is going to follow the new federal boundaries while also keeping the extra seats up north because provincially we have more seats there, which tend to favor the New Democrats, but I don't think the Conservatives would get rid of those seats. So that's also like the big question too is, when are we going to the polls, but also will we have a new electoral map? And I did some fun like speculating in the newsletter with that about how it would play out, and the Conservatives still come out on top.
The one thing that always strikes me is we're looking at the polls right now, and the polls show apparently Ontario loves conservatives, whether it's federally or provincially. But I do take that with all that news with a grain of salt, because once you get down to it, once you actually have to start looking at the track record of the Ford government, there are a lot of people who are upset. There's underfunding of education system, healthcare, long-term care homes. A lot of these things are still there's still a factor in people's minds, and I'm wondering, are the Conservatives aware enough to understand that people are upset that their children's schools are not getting adequate funding, the class sizes are increasing, that health wait times in healthcare are increasing, and the encroaching privatization of Galen Weston's Maple service, people are a little wary on that encroachment. Are the Conservatives that you've talked with, are they aware of this kind of unease in the public, even though it might not be reflected in the polls right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you kind of brought up a great point here because what sort of started all this, or I guess, really ramped up this early election talk was the fact that they're speeding up the beer store breakup. And so there's going to be more alcohol sales in corner stores, big box stores, gas stations. And that's like straight out of Doug Ford's populist playbook, right? Like that was a 2018 promise he made. And life is so much different than it was in 2018. And so while that I think is still going to appeal to his base, this was a long time coming and they're finally making good on it. I don't know if that's the thing that's going to bring people out to the polls, right? If you've had any interaction with the healthcare system in the last couple of years, you'll know that is top of mind for a lot of people. Cost of living is too, and while there's only so much in the province's purview when it comes to cost of living, I think Doug Ford also takes some of the hit. If you're any government and incumbent government, you're kind of taking a hit on that. But at the same time, we're kind of seeing a lot of blame being put on Justin Trudeau when healthcare, housing, education, these are all provincial issues. So that's kind of an interesting thing to me too. But I think you're right. And one thing that I know that conservative insiders are ticked off about, especially, your true blue Tories, not necessarily Ford Nation people, that this government is spending so much money. They've punted budget balance to 2026, although they could do some financial maneuvering to get the budget balanced by spring 2025 and potentially go to the polls early. But the big question is now, I mean, especially the breakup with the beer store, like this is essentially corporate welfare, not something we expect from small speak conservatives, not something we'd expect from Doug Ford, who promised to cancel the gravy train. Meanwhile, salaries in his office are blowing up. Basically any politician that's a conservative at Queen's Park has some type of role and therefore a little pay bump. You're either, on the front bench in cabinet, or you're an associate minister, or you've got a position like on committee, that whole thing. And so I think that for a lot of like true blue financial conservatives, they're not really happy with Doug Ford, and especially with this beer store deal, spending millions that I think a lot of people would rather see go towards education or go towards healthcare. So I think it's not lost on them, but I just want to add quickly, you kind of made me think that on the education front, they have been making these like popular announcements, like cracking down on cell phones in schools. I know that would be popular with parents, making financial literacy mandatory on the curriculum for high school students. I know that's another thing, but these are like goodies that you would present during a campaign rather than really getting to the nitty gritty of like class size, the things that, unions are talking about, and the funding and all of that stuff. So I think, yeah, like these are more of the flashy sides that the conservatives are hoping will win over voters. And especially things like infrastructure too. We're going to see a lot of emphasis on, every little construction announcement, or we've got this RFP out there to build this. Like, I think they're going to really be milking those announcements over the coming months.
Well, there's that. I mean, we our last episode we had on Mike Moffat to talk about the housing, where we were right now in the housing crisis in this province, and his focus was a lot on the province needs to step up and with the policy aspect, change the rules of the game so that housing can be built. So, I think that would come into effect. I do question the beer store announcement, though, as you said. That this seems to be something like they can kind of like that going to the base, we promise cheaper beer and whatnot. But there's reports saying that in the end of the day, price of beer might go up. And I'm inclined to believe it, because if we remember back when Doug Ford first took office, he was going to say, we're going to privatize cannabis, just allow stores to pop up wherever in our communities. And it seems like on every street corner, there's now some mom and pop cannabis store, but the price of the product is still quite expensive from my understanding. And the idea that the market was going to bring down prices did not materialize. And so I bring this up saying, again, it's that timing. It's what kind of Roland said, like, if we're going to do this, let's do it now, because if they're waiting until spring of 2025, if beer prices have actually gone up by then, because the plan didn't work out, isn't that something like, kind of like, geez, Doug, you screwed this up. And I'm wondering, like I said, like this, do they really want to wait to see if this unfolds? Because they don't really have a good track record of success on these kind of mom and pop table decision making ideas.
Yeah, just think about Buck-a beer, right? Like Buck-a
Yeah.
beer was short-lived. It's dead now. I don't think there are any, there are no takers right now of any, retailers. But yeah, I think you're right. And there are a lot of the fine print of the beer store deal, I think, is, we're going to have to see how it plays out. The beer store itself still has to keep, hundreds of stores running for the next couple of years under this new agreement. And I think one thing, it's not only potentially the price that might go up, it's also like a hit to the government coffers. And that means, like, not only are we spending millions to do this, but the LCBO, I guess private retailers will essentially be able to undercut the LCBO and will be able to sell for a little bit cheaper, because they'll get a wholesale discount. And so that obviously means less money for the province, but that's less money also that we can spend on healthcare, on education, on even, paying down provincial debt, things that also, Doug Ford used to talk a lot about. And so I do kind of wonder if you're really looking at this. I think the headline on the Globe and Mail, or in one of their op-ed pieces was, that this is not good news. This is essentially a scandal, because, just think about a nurse in Thunder Bay when she's hearing about this, that we're spending millions to speed this up just by, a few months. I'm sure they would not be happy about that.
The big question I guess I have is, given, we're halfway through the second term of this government now, their achievements have been, I think, even many conservatives would say, pretty modest. They haven't really delivered an awful lot for their base. They've delivered plenty for developers, and they've delivered, they've certainly tried to deliver for the kind of business sector. Whether they've actually achieved that, I think, is much more debatable. There's been some major scandals. Greenbelt issue obviously being the main one, but it's not like a whole bunch of other issues. Right back in their first term, there was Doug Ford before COVID getting booed in the middle of Toronto, and it seemed like the wheels are falling off, and yet somehow here we are halfway through the second term with, well, it looks like it's going to just be a fairly easy walk for Doug Ford to get a third term. I mean, why? What is wrong with the NDP and the Liberals that they can't make bigger inroads into this? I mean, we spoke to you last just before the Milton by-election, and I think we thought that would be close, and it really wasn't actually that close. I mean, they kind of won quite easily. What is up? I mean, do you get any sense at Queen's Park from the parties, like why they can't why they can't land any punches on Doug?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a little of both, right? The fact that the premier is like Teflon, but also the opposition parties have such a hard time getting their message out there. And there's a lot at play there. Like I think Mart Stiles in the NDP, if you're like us and you're watching Question Period every day, she's doing a pretty good job of holding Doug Ford to account. But then, it's most of the public watching Question Period every day. I don't think so. I don't actually think it's that entertaining. And so not only is it hard for Mart Stiles and the NDP, it's also like Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, right? And we know the Liberal brand is still strong. Like Bonnie Crombie has given a boost to the party a little bit, obviously nowhere near where Doug Ford is performing, but she's kind of taken support for the NDP. So again, just like in 22, it's almost like the race for second place is the one everyone's watching now. But you're right, they have really had a hard time getting their message out there. And I think it's also part of it is this whopping majority that Doug Ford has. And they're also spending a lot of money on advertising, and that stuff plays a part in public perception, of course. And I think we talked about Doug Ford pre-COVID. I think generally the public was very forgiving to a lot of governments, and a lot of people in power. We were all figuring out the pandemic at the same time, and then even recovery, and now. And we see Doug Ford also leaning into it. He's like, well, you can't always get it right. We make mistakes. And I think we've talked before about how Doug Ford just seems like that guy you want to have a beer with. And obviously that charisma goes very far. Meanwhile, the NDP hasn't really been able to land I guess solid punches, but they are doing better than before. I mean, when it comes to fundraising and their profile out there, they are technically the official opposition. But I think Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals really need to pick up the pace a bit, because Doug Ford, the number one rule in politics is define yourself before your opponents do. And Doug Ford and the NDP have been attacking Bonnie Crombie as, an elitist, Justin Trudeau's BFF, tax and spend liberal. And, she might be popular and well-known in the 905, but she's really got to go beyond that. And I think a lot of Liberals are still licking their wounds from Milton, because that was such a wider lead too. So really,
okay,
that could have been Bonnie's moment to shine.
I can't help coming back and saying, like, Milton is right next door to Bonnie Crombie's old riding, right next door to Mississauga. It's Heartland 905, and they couldn't even get close to winning the riding. Oh my God, this is terrible. I mean, it's certainly if I was in the party, I would be feeling like, well, this is our brand new leader, and that's the best we could do. But at the same time, the NDP can't land a punch on the Liberals, seemingly, because, if the NDP are going to seriously think about forming a government, they need to be making headway in places like Milton as well. And they're not even on the map. They're not even putting up a serious candidate. I mean, how on earth are we going to get from here to one of these parties forming some kind of a majority unless something changes? I don't know. I mean, I guess there's no real question in that statement, but perhaps you could find one.
No, I think you're right. It was more of a bigger loss for Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals than it was a win for Doug Ford and the PCs, if that makes sense, because we saw Doug Ford also go full tilt. Like they were firing on all cylinders. They had a bunch of cabinet ministers door knocking out there, the premier himself. And it's not like you can do that in a general election, right? Like they had all their resources pooled there. So you could tell they were obviously shaking in their boots a little bit, and then it paid off. The Liberals, I think you're right. And we had heard that, Bonnie Crombie herself said that when she was door knocking with their candidate, who was, pretty low profile compared to Z Hamid, the MPP, the Conservative that won. They said that, she was recognized at the doors, that people in Milton, just next door to Mississauga, where she was mayor, recognized her. And so I do wonder if she had actually ended up running, would the Liberals have won that seat? But I think at the end of the day, she decided that she could do better work, outside of the House for now. And I would actually, I guess maybe in hindsight, it's 2020. Initially, I had thought it was a smart idea for her to sit that by-election out, but now I'm sure they would have been a lot happier if she had been in the House, if they had won, and especially if we're going to go to the polls in spring 2025.
Sticking with the Liberal theming of this so far, I wonder if you could just answer this simple question for me. What is the Liberal messaging? Because, Bonnie's been leader for a few months now, and the Tories are defining her as a tax and spend Liberal, irresponsible with the coffers. And it seems to be, I'm thinking it's sticking with in certain circles, or at least it's muddying up the waters. But I don't know what the messaging is from the Liberals. I've not heard a consistent messaging of this is what's needed to address the issues that they want to prioritize, and this is what they're going to do to address it. And I'm wondering, do the Liberals have a message that they're sticking to, that they're trying to push through, that's not getting out to the rest of us?
Yeah, and I mean that's a good question, and I don't know if I have a good answer, because I don't know if they've actually been, efficient enough to be getting their message out there. And
Maybe
they
that's
are
the
still
answer.
figuring it out. Yeah, exactly. And they're still figuring it out, right? They're doing like these policy chats like with their grassroots members to like help inform their platform, all that. They're taking their
Joel and I
time.
know all about policy chats with members. That's just a membership drive. Those are not real
Yeah, well,
things.
I think Bonnie also has to like make good a little bit with the party too, because it wasn't a slam dunk for her during the leadership, and so she's also got to make amends, because it was a hotly contested leadership race. Not everyone was behind her in the beginning, but yeah, you're right, and I think that what the main message we've been hearing so far from the Liberals is the same thing that we hear from the NDP, and it's still like opposition mode. And there's two parts here. Like, you have to hold Doug Ford accountable. We hear the Liberals talking a lot about Doug Ford's insiders, how he's corrupt and, just in it for his buddies and donors and that sort of thing. But that's kind of the same line of attack that the NDP and Conservatives are pinning on Bonnie Crombie. I mean, she has a lot of the same developer donors. She too has, high profile events, like fundraising events, that sort of thing. And so I think that, talking about insiders and your connection to them might also backfire on Bonnie Crombie. But at the same time, it's sort of like, I think about that Spider-Man meme when they're like all pointing at each other. That's kind of what the attack line from the Conservatives are like too, because Doug Ford is literally under investigation for the RCMP and the Greenbelt and potential, insiders that were favored and in that process and whatnot. But you're right. I mean, the Liberals have been attacking Doug Ford, but there's two sides to this. You have to do that, but you also have to show the public, this is what we stand for, this is who we are, this is our message, and this is why you should vote for us as the alternative to Doug Ford and the NDP. And I think a lot of Liberals, during the post-mortem, said that was lacking during 2022 under Stephen Del Duca.
I mean, the Liberals, have they made a rod for their own back to an extent? Because I mean, you mentioned that, okay, so Bonnie Crombie, they now have a leader, which at least they didn't have before. And immediately, in terms of, insofar as they get a bump in the polls, it's a bump at the expense of the NDP. Now, they just chose a right wing, perceived as someone on to the right of the party, like pro-business, all this stuff. That's already becoming a weakness for her. That's how everybody's attacking her, that she's a right-wing liberal, not a left-wing liberal. Even the Tories are attacking her for being a right-wing liberal. I mean, should they not have picked someone who was actually would have been, much more comfortable for NDP voters to go, okay, we can vote for this liberal. This is a progressive that we can get on board with, who we feel comfortable with, and we can move out back to the Liberals from the NDP that we voted for last time. I mean, are they going simply after the wrong party ultimately if they actually want to form a government?
No, that's really compelling because we kind of saw the NDP under Andrea Horwath also go more towards the center, right? And I think that she got an earful from a lot of the activists, grassroots in her party on that. And you're right, Bonnie Crombie, right out of the gate, she kind of messed up a little bit, put her foot in her mouth, and had to say, correct her phrase, but she had essentially said that we govern from like more of the center, but I think she had essentially suggested center right, and I think it's interesting because in Ontario it also feels like it's shifted a bit, and I do think it is more centrist now, and that's why I think it might actually end up being a smart play for the Liberals to go more towards the right, even though it feels like everyone's kind of in the center in Ontario anyway, maybe more center right. Because I do think Doug Ford has actually gone more left, which is also surprising. It's like emphasis on the progressive and progressive conservative, right? And if you think back to when he was elected in 2018 and during even the PC leadership, it was social conservatives that helped Doug win that and help him become leader and eventually premier. And he had promised things like he was going to look at the sex ed curriculum again, but he didn't really make many changes to it when it came down to it. And I think, ticked off a lot of social conservatives. Now we have the new Blue Party of Ontario, sort of a fringe, more right spinoff. And actually they performed really well in the Milton by-election, which I thought was interesting, beating out the Greens. And so I do think that maybe everyone is moving more towards the center. And I think that it might be smart for the NDP to just completely go left, way more left than the Liberals ever would, especially when it comes to things like climate change, things that are still popular with the public. And so that's really interesting, is where everyone falls on the political spectrum, because I think if we saw the NDP just go, full tilt, go completely left, then that might actually end up picking up some of those middling, more progressive voters that might be deciding between Liberal and New Democrat, because strategic voting, just the way our system works in this country, is always a factor in elections.
Well,
I can't resist. Sorry, Joel. I'll say one thing and then I'll shut up. And that is, first past the post. We have to get rid of it, please, please, please. We have to get rid of it. It breaks everything, and I know that's certainly not journalistic of me to say that, but yeah, this is this crazy situation we have where basically we have three parties fighting over the same voters, and one party that's got a chunk of voters that nobody else seems to want, or certainly cannot get. And yeah, it's very frustrating to me that this is the way things will work, and then we go into another election and it's the same old stuff where everybody ends up voting for a party they don't like. It's crazy. Anyway, that is not a question, that's just a statement.
Well, I kind of on that statement though, and as you were just saying, Sabrina, to bring this conversation maybe back full circle, is that it seems to me that the NDP and the Liberals are they don't have sure footing at the moment. They're very much, kind of in an existential crisis of like who are we, who do we support, who are we fighting for, and again, to me, if I was the Ontario PC party, I say, well, my opponents are dazed and confused in the ring. Like I can, even if I pull the trigger, and it's an election that nobody wants. Like right now, how in your opinion, how strong of a fight could the NDP or the Liberals put up to really kind of sock it to Doug Ford? Because right now, I don't see a consistent messaging. I don't even see a consistent team. At least with the Liberals, I don't. That they're really able to go forward and say, okay, you know what, fine, you want this fight, Doug, we'll bring it to you, and we're going to give you a good shellacking. I just like if I'm making the math as in the Tory back rooms, I'm saying, okay, yeah, we might get a bit of a pounding from the Ontario public. They may not like us doing this, but our opponents do not have. Our opponents are weak, probably the weakest that they're ever going to be for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, you're right. And I think they probably are maybe weighing the pros and cons of it, because I think it might even be worth it that the public might be ticked off, but not as much as, the Liberals and the NDP would be scrambling, and especially the Liberals. I mean, Bonnie Crombie was just elected a few months ago as leader in December, right? And so she's still gaining her footing. Those core people she had, and I will just say, just for some inside baseball, she has sort of enlisted the same old Liberal crew that we see, Tom Allison, and those folks to help run the campaign. But she's also got her own team too. Darren MacArthur is basically her chief of staff, the folks that helped her win the leadership, that have helped her, in Mississauga, and that's obviously a key area. And so there is like, these two, I guess, combating factions in the Liberal Party that I do wonder, if people are going to be butting heads. There's still all this transition. Everyone's still, settling into their groove. And so, yeah, you're right. It might actually end up being worth it for Doug Ford to go to the polls early. Me personally, it's like I kind of want us to go early just so we can stop talking about it. And also it's like our Super Bowl, right? So it's just really interesting and exciting to happen. But I'm not sure if the public feels that way.
Well, the public never likes elections. I mean, we love democracy. We hate elections, which is, I guess, the quintessential Canadian poli-sci 101. But again, I mean, it's not a problem with Bonnie Crombie. I mean, I'm kind of looking at this. I'm wondering, like, Nate Erskine-Smith, Yasser Naqvi, who were prominent in the provincial election, have kind of faded away from the provincial election scene, and there's just no like all-star hitters I see in the Liberal backbench, like provincially at the moment. As you said, Darren MacArthur, Tom Allison, like these are 905, 416 centric political operatives. They're very well known in these areas, but you need to build the party out. I mean, the party, it needs to start building in southwestern Ontario, out in the eastern townships, definitely up north. Like they need to kind of rebuild from the grassroots up. And I'm just wondering, do you even if they do, even if an election isn't called, do they have the time to really kind of build up that big red machine again that's been kind of dormant for 6 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's still not even a lot of time until our actual election date in 2026, right? And Bonnie Crombie really has her work cut out for her. It's interesting though, when you mentioned though, Nate and Yasser, I guess her leadership competition and MPs, like I kind of wonder about the timing of this, if we would see more MPs, Liberal MPs who might be worried about losing their federal seat now want to run for Bonnie Crombie provincially. I wonder if we're going to see more of that, or even more conservatives. I think that might also be a telltale sign if we see some more PCs, bowing out and saying they want to run for Pierre Poilievre later this year. I think you can probably maybe actually place some money on the fact that we might have an early election. But yeah, you're right. I think, the Liberals have a long way to go. They have the most candidates to nominate because obviously they don't have as many incumbents. And so Bonnie Crombie really it needs to kind of get a move on. And that's what I hear from a lot of Liberals too. And they are all telling her, we've got to prepare for the possibility that we're going to go to the polls. And I think that it could possibly not be a good outcome for anyone except Doug Ford. And so that's why everyone is saying this might happen, because it's the most advantageous for Doug Ford. But at the end of the day, it would obviously cost a lot of money, resources, staff, and the Liberals just are nowhere near where they need to be competitive in any election.
I mean, we're coming to the end of our time, so we let you go. But I think that story of the fundraising situation for the opposition parties is one that almost deserves an episode to itself. Certainly, when I looked a couple of years ago, just sort of picking at random, the numbers that, like you were mentioning earlier, that the Conservatives are way ahead by like $4 million or something, and I actually think that number still maybe flatters the opposition parties in terms of the central parties have some ability to fundraise. The riding associations, so many of them, traditionally the riding associations drive a huge amount of the fundraising, and I don't think actually they do anymore in many cases, because they don't have the membership and they don't have the wherewithal to actually do that work very much. So, I can remember looking at a riding in Ottawa, which is a Liberal heartland still, insofar as the provincial party goes, and seeing the PCs out fundraising I mean, basically they raised all the money that they're allowed to for an election in 1 year. and then they spent it and raised it again, which they can do obviously because there's no financial limits outside the writ period. So you can raise it, spend it, raise it, spend it. You can send it to the central party. You can do whatever you like with it. Meanwhile, you've got both the opposition parties this is, you know, not necessarily in a safe seat, raising, you know, like a couple of $100 in 12 months. It's so the chasm between the parties is frightening to behold when you look at it at that kind of local level. Anyway, once again, I've said something with no great question at the end, but I mean, I guess that speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the kind of situation that we're in?
Yeah, and I think conservatives traditionally have always been the big donor party, right? Like I guess they tend to sell tickets that go for, you know, thousands of dollars for a rubber chicken dinner, whereas the NDP they pride themselves on being the party of smaller donors, you know, people giving $20, $30 here and there. But I also think the fact that they're in power helps too. You know, who wants to pay hundreds of dollars to go rub shoulders with the Liberals, especially when they didn't have a leader too? I mean, they're third place and not recognized. And so I think with someone like Bonnie Crombie now, they're trying to ramp that up a little bit. But again, I think, you know, especially for stakeholders and the folks that are buying tickets to these events, you want to be rubbing shoulders with the guys who are making the decisions. And that right now are the conservatives. So I think you're right. There's a lot of factors at play here. But fundraising, especially for the Liberals, I think is a challenge, but something that, you know, Bonnie Crombie was flexing and a lot of people liked about her during the leadership. So I think, you know, she's going to have to walk the talk a little bit.
Well, I think we should draw it to a close there. But thanks again, Sabrina Nanji, for joining us today. It's really great to be able to speak to you and get a real inside view into Queen's Park.
Yeah, happy to do it anytime.
Thanks very much.